After the divorce, she was left with nothing but a crumbling cabin in the mountains. But what she found hidden inside its walls would change her life forever. Nora Whitfield had spent 32 years building a life she believed was permanent. She had poured every ounce of herself into a marriage, a home, a future she thought belonged to both of them. And then one morning in a small office that smelled of old carpet and printer ink, she watched all of it disappear with the stroke of a pen. If this is your first time here, take a moment now to subscribe so you never miss a story. New tales arrive every week, each one crafted to carry you gently into sleep. The attorney's office was on the fourth floor of a building in downtown Asheville. Beige walls, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above, a window that overlooked a parking garage. Nora sat on one side of a narrow conference table, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the documents slide toward her, one at a time. The attorney spoke in measured tones, explaining clauses and subdivisions, pointing with the tip of his pen to lines that required her signature. She heard the words but understood almost none of them. It was as if the man was speaking from behind a wall of water, his voice muffled and distant, reaching her only a sound without meaning. She was 58 years old, and she was sitting in a room being told in the politest possible language that the life she had known was officially over. Grant sat across from her, her husband, her former husband. He wore a navy blazer and a calm expression that hadn't changed once during the entire proceeding. That was the part she couldn't stop looking at, his face, the steadiness of it, as if this moment cost him nothing, as if 32 years could be folded, neatly placed into a manila envelope and filed away without a single tremor in his hands. She picked up the pen. It was heavier than she expected. Or maybe her fingers had simply forgotten how to grip things properly. She signed where the attorney pointed, once, twice, a third time. Each signature felt like a small surrender, a white flag pressed into ink. When it was done, the attorney gathered the pages, tapped them against the table to align the edges, and placed them inside a folder. He thanked them both for their time. Grant stood immediately, buttoned his blazer, and extended his hand to the attorney, as though concluding a business transaction. No hesitation, no heaviness. Outside on the sidewalk, the September air carried the first suggestion of autumn. Leaves had just begun to turn along the edges of the street, gold creeping into green. Grant walked beside her for a few steps. Then he stopped. "I hope you find what you are looking for, Nora." She turned to face him. For a moment, she searched his eyes for something. Regret, sadness, guilt, anything that might suggest the last 3 decades had mattered. She found nothing, only the same polished calm he had worn inside. She didn't answer. She walked to her car, sat behind the wheel, and closed the door. Then she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and wept. She wept for a long time, not quietly, not politely. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere below the ribs, from a place the body keeps sealed until it can't anymore. Everything she had built was gone. The house in Hendersonville had sold in 11 days. The savings were divided. The legal fees had consumed most of what remained. She was living now in a rented studio apartment above a laundromat where the walls vibrated gently every 45 minutes when the machines below shifted into their spin cycles. Her entire life fit into 14 cardboard boxes stacked along one wall. 14 boxes. That was the sum of 32 years. The weeks that followed moved slowly, as if time itself had thickened. Nora went through the motions of daily life, grocery shopping, paying bills, making coffee each morning in a kitchen so small she could touch both walls. If she stretched out her arms, but everything felt muted. Colors seemed less vivid. Food tasted like nothing. Conversations with old friends left her exhausted. She would hang up the phone and sit in silence for long stretches, staring at a spot on the wall where the paint had bubbled slightly from moisture. She had spent so many years being Grant's wife that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be Nora. And now that the title had been removed, she wasn't sure who remained underneath. One afternoon, while sorting through a box she hadn't yet opened, she found a photograph tucked between 2 books. It showed her and Grant on vacation somewhere warm, maybe the Outer Banks, maybe Hilton Head. They were smiling, tanned. She was leaning into his shoulder, and his arm was wrapped around her waist. They looked like people who had figured out how to be happy. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she placed it face down inside the box and pushed the box into a corner. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, on a Tuesday evening when rain streaked the windows of her apartment, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, a North Carolina area code she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something, perhaps boredom, perhaps the particular loneliness of a rainy Tuesday, made her answer. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who identified herself as a notary public, handling the estate of one Constance Hargrove. The name floated across the line and hovered there. Nora frowned. She knew the name, but only barely. Constance Connie Hargrove was her great-aunt on her mother's side. A woman she had met perhaps 4 or 5 times in her entire life, always briefly, always at family gatherings where Connie seemed to exist on the periphery. Arriving late, speaking little, and leaving before dessert, Nora remembered a tall woman with silver hair pulled back tightly. A long wool coat regardless of the season, and eyes that watched everything but revealed nothing. The notary explained that Connie had passed away several months earlier. Quietly alone in a place called Elkhorn Hollow, a small community deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina. There was no estate to speak of, no bank accounts, no investments, no life insurance. The only asset left behind was a cabin. A cabin! Nora almost laughed. She had spent weeks agonizing over how to rebuild her life, calculating every dollar, measuring every possibility. And now the universe had handed her a rotting structure on a mountainside, as if to say, "Here, this is what you're worth." She thanked the notary politely and hung up. For several days she didn't think about the cabin at all. Or rather, she tried not to. But the idea kept returning at odd moments, while brushing her teeth, while waiting for the coffee to brew, while lying awake at 2 in the morning listening to the laundromat machines rumble beneath the floor. A cabin. In the mountains. Belonging to a woman she barely knew. Eventually, almost without deciding, she realized she was going to drive up there. Not because she expected anything, not because she had a plan, but because she had nothing else pulling her in any direction. And at least this was a direction. She left early on a Saturday morning. The drive took nearly 4 hours. As she moved west from Asheville, the roads narrowed and the landscape thickened. Strip malls gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to forest. The trees pressed closer on both sides, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the sunlight into shifting patterns across the windshield. Her phone signal dropped to a single bar, then disappeared entirely. She passed through a town so small it consisted of a post office, a gas station, and a church with a hand-painted sign. Then the road turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to dirt, and the dirt wound upward through switchbacks bordered by rhododendron and mountain laurel. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, Nora brought the car to a stop and sat staring at it for a full minute. It was worse than she had imagined. The structure was old, not charmingly old, not rustic postcard old, but genuinely deteriorated. The roof sagged visibly on one side. Several window panes were cracked. The porch railing had partially collapsed. Paint, what little remained, hung from the wooden siding in pale curling strips like dead skin. The yard, if it could be called that, was overgrown with weeds and wild grass that reached nearly to the porch steps. Nora turned off the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. No traffic, no neighbors, no machines humming below the floor. Only the sound of wind moving through the trees, and somewhere distant, the faint murmur of water over rocks. She stepped out of the car. The mountain air hit her immediately, cool, sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. And something else, something older. Something that had no name but felt like solitude given a smell. The notary had mailed her a key. She pulled it from her pocket now. A brass key, heavy and tarnished, its teeth worn smooth by decades of use. She held it in her palm for a moment. Such a small thing, such an ordinary thing. And yet it was at this particular moment the only door in the world she had the right to open. She climbed the porch steps carefully. The boards groaned. The front door resisted at first, swollen from moisture, then gave way with a sound like a long exhale. Inside, the air was thick with dust and stillness. A fine gray layer covered every surface: tables, chairs, shelves. The arms of a faded armchair positioned near a stone fireplace. The furniture was old but solid. Wooden pieces built by hand meant to last generations. Curtains hung in tatters from iron rods above the windows. A clock on the wall had stopped at 3:20, though whether morning or afternoon, and how many years ago was impossible to say. Nora moved through the room slowly. Each step raised small clouds of dust that drifted in the light slanting through the cracked windows. She found a kitchen with cast iron pots still hanging from hooks, a bedroom with a quilt folded at the foot of a bare mattress, a bathroom with a porcelain sink stained amber by years of mineral-rich water, and photographs. Everywhere photographs, framed on walls, propped on shelves, tucked into the edges of mirrors. Black and white images of people she didn't recognize. Men in overalls standing beside horses. Women in cotton dresses holding infants. Group portraits taken in front of buildings that no longer existed. Faces from another century watching her with patient, unreadable expressions. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own breathing. That first night she stayed though she hadn't planned to. She swept the dust from the mattress, spread her jacket over the quilt, and lay down fully clothed. The wind pressed against the cabin walls and made the wood creak in patterns that sounded almost like speech. She stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what she was doing there. The next morning she drove down to the town, Elkhorn Hollow. It sat in a narrow valley where two ridges met, a cluster of buildings arranged around a small square, a general store, a post office, a diner with a hand-lettered menu in the window, a white-clappered church. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were spotted immediately. She felt the eyes on her the moment she stepped out of the car. Not hostile, curious. The particular attention that small communities give to unfamiliar faces. Inside the general store, a woman named Loretta rang up her purchases: bread, canned soup, coffee, batteries. The conversation was friendly until Nora mentioned that she was staying at Connie Hargrove's cabin. Loretta's hands paused for just a fraction of a second over the register. Her smile didn't disappear, but something behind it shifted. She finished the transaction without asking any further questions. Nora noticed. She filed it away. Over the next several days, the same thing happened repeatedly. Each time she mentioned Connie Hargrove, the response was the same: a brief silence, a subtle withdrawal, a change of subject. People were not rude. They simply stopped talking, as if the name itself were a door that everyone in Elkhorn Hollow had agreed to keep shut. One afternoon, needing coffee and warmth, Nora walked into a small diner across from the square. She chose a table near the window. The place was nearly empty, just two men sitting at a table in the back, speaking in low tones over mugs of black coffee. She ordered tea and watched the street outside. Then she heard it. One of the men said the name Hargrove, quietly, almost under his breath. Nora kept her eyes on the window but focused every particle of her attention on the conversation behind her. The words came in fragments, half swallowed by the ambient noise of the kitchen. Sooner or later, someone's going to find what Connie buried. The other man responded with something she couldn't quite catch. Then the first man spoke again, his voice dropping even lower. She leaned slightly, straining to hear, but the men had noticed her. The conversation stopped. Chairs scraped. Moments later, the bell above the door chimed as they left. Nora sat very still. Her tea grew cold in front of her. Those words played and replayed in her mind like a record caught in a groove. What Connie buried. Not hid, not kept, buried. As if whatever it was had been placed underground deliberately, as if it was meant to stay there. That evening back at the cabin, she began searching. She didn't know what she was looking for. She opened drawers, examined closets, pulled books from shelves, and fanned their pages. She found old receipts, faded letters about ordinary things, a collection of pressed wildflowers between sheets of wax paper. Nothing that seemed important, nothing that explained why the name Connie Hargrove made an entire town go quiet. She was still searching when the storm arrived. It came without much warning. The sky, which had been a steady gray all afternoon, darkened rapidly after sunset. By 9 o'clock, the wind had shifted from a gentle push to a sustained howl that made the cabin groan along its joints. Rain began first scattered, then heavy, then torrential, hammering the roof and the windows with a fury that seemed personal. Lightning split the darkness in sharp white flashes. Thunder rolled between the mountains like something enormous turning over in its sleep. Nora lit candles when the electricity flickered. She secured the windows as best she could. She sat in the armchair near the cold fireplace and listened to the storm dismantle the silence she had grown accustomed to. Then she heard something that was not the storm, a sharp crack from above. Not wind against wood, not a branch striking the roof, something heavier, more deliberate. She looked up at the ceiling, listened. Another sound, a scraping like something shifting across a hard surface. The attic. She picked up a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The sounds grew clearer. They were coming from above the ceiling from a space she hadn't yet explored. At the end of the hallway, she found a small door, paint-sealed and stiff. She pulled hard. It opened with a rush of cold air that smelled of dust and old wood, and something faintly metallic. The attic was low-ceilinged and dark. Her flashlight beam moved across boxes, broken furniture stacks of old newspapers tied with twine. The source of the noise became apparent quickly. A section of the roof had shifted in the storm, and a heavy shelf had partially collapsed, spilling its contents across the floor. She began clearing the debris, and then she stopped. Behind the fallen shelf, partially exposed by its collapse, was a section of wall that looked different from the rest. The wood was the same color, the same grain, but the seams didn't match. There was a vertical line, almost invisible, that separated this panel from the wall around it. It had been built to blend in. It had been built to hide. Nora's hands moved before her mind gave permission. She ran her fingers along the edges of the panel. Near the bottom corner, she felt a small irregularity, a latch or a catch disguised within the wood grain. She pressed it. Nothing. She pressed harder, angling her thumb into the groove. A soft click. The panel shifted. She pushed. The section of wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow space no larger than the inside of a closet that had been sealed behind the wall for what appeared to be decades. Dust lay thick as velvet over everything inside. And there, placed carefully in the center of the space, as if someone had set it down, knowing that one day another pair of hands would lift it again, was a box. An iron box, heavy and dark with age, its surface spotted with rust, but its structure still solid. Nora pulled it out with both hands. The metal was cold against her skin. She carried it to a small table near the attic window and set it down. The latch was old but not locked. She opened it. Inside, arranged with obvious care, were several yellowed envelopes tied together with a ribbon that had faded from what might once have been blue. Beneath them lay a stack of old photographs. And beneath those, wrapped in a cloth so dark it was nearly black, was a journal. Thick, leather-bound, heavy. She untied the ribbon first. The envelopes contained letters, some written to Connie, some written by her, all dated decades in the past. She set them aside. The photographs showed people she didn't recognize gathered in front of buildings and landscapes that meant nothing to her yet. Then she opened the journal. On the first page, in handwriting that was precise and deliberate, she read a name, Constance Hargrove, and beneath it a date from more than 40 years ago. She turned the pages slowly. The early entries described daily life in the mountains, weather visitors, small observations about the changing seasons. But as the pages advanced, the tone shifted. Connie began writing about family properties, about land that had been taken, about documents that had vanished and signatures that didn't belong to the people whose names they bore, about a truth that had been buried, that word again, to protect the interests of people with more power than conscience. Nora read for hours. The storm raged outside while inside the attic by the narrow beam of her flashlight. A dead woman's handwriting slowly began to reshape everything she thought she knew about her family. Then she reached a page marked with a small piece of fabric pressed between the sheets. The ink was darker here, as if Connie had pressed the pen harder, as if the words required more force to write. If you are reading this, it means you found the box. It also means the time has finally come to know the truth. Nora's breath caught in her chest. She read the sentence again and again. Those words had been written years ago, perhaps decades ago, by a woman sitting in this very cabin, hiding a box behind a wall, sealing a secret inside a stormproof space, and trusting that someday, the right person would find it. She closed the journal and held it against her chest. The rain continued to pound the roof above her. The candle on the table flickered in a draught she couldn't locate. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, Nora descended from the attic. She stepped outside onto the porch, still holding the journal. The storm had passed. The air smelled washed and raw. Mist hung low between the ridges, turning the mountains into layers of pale blue watercolor. She looked down at the ground near the porch steps and felt the warmth drain from her body. There, pressed clearly into the soft mud left by the rain, were footprints. Boot prints. Large, deep, and recent. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, paused beneath the kitchen window, and then returned to the trees. Someone had been there. During the storm, while she was in the attic reading a dead woman's secrets, someone had walked through the rain to this cabin and stood outside the window, close enough to see the light of her candle moving through the rooms. Nora looked toward the trees. The mist swirled between the trunks, thick and silent. Nothing moved. No one was visible, but the prints were undeniable. She was not alone on this mountain, and whoever else was out there already knew she had begun to search. She looked down at the brass key still hanging from the chain around her neck, the same key that had opened the cabin door on her first day. It caught a sliver of early light and gleamed faintly like a small promise, or a small warning. She wasn't yet sure which. She stepped back inside and locked the door behind her. The morning after the storm, Nora drove down the mountain with the journal on the passenger seat beside her. She had spent the early hours reading more of Connie's entries, and one detail kept pulling at her attention, a small pencil sketch tucked between two pages. It showed a building near a town square with a mark drawn in red ink over the entrance. Beneath the sketch in Connie's careful hand were 6 words. The first step is where no one remembers to look. Nora parked at the edge of the square in Elkhorn Hollow and stood on the sidewalk holding the sketch against the morning light, comparing it to the buildings around her. The general store, the post office, the diner, the church. None of them matched. She turned slowly, scanning the far end of the square, and then she saw it, a stone building set back slightly from the others. Older, narrower, with high windows and a faded wooden sign above the door that had lost most of its lettering. Only fragments remained, enough to suggest words that might once have read county records or perhaps municipal archives. The front entrance was locked. She cupped her hands against the glass and peered inside. Shelves, stacks of boxes, a long counter coated in dust. "Can I help you with something?" She turned. A man stood on the sidewalk behind her, perhaps 60 or so, with gray hair that needed cutting and wire-framed glasses resting low on his nose. He carried a leather satchel under one arm and held a paper cup of coffee in the other hand. His expression was not unfriendly, but it carried the particular caution of someone accustomed to observing before engaging. Nora hesitated. Then she held up the sketch. She explained that she had inherited Connie Hargrove's cabin and found this drawing among her belongings. She was trying to understand what this building had been. The man looked at the sketch for a long moment. Then he looked at her. That was the old county archive. Land records, property deeds, survey documents going back over 100 years. Most of it was moved to the regional office in Marion about 15 years ago. Some of it was lost. Some of it, I suspect, was removed deliberately. His name was Declan Mercer. He was a historian, independent, he clarified, which she understood to mean underfunded and largely ignored. He had spent years researching historical land records across the western counties. When Nora mentioned Connie's name, something shifted behind his eyes. Not the guarded withdrawal she had encountered everywhere else in town. Something closer to recognition, or perhaps relief. They sat on a bench near the square. Nora told him about the journal, about the references to family properties taken through forged documents, about the entry addressed directly to whoever found the box. She did not tell him everything. She kept certain details back, the specific names, the dates, the phrases that felt most urgent. She wasn't ready to trust anyone completely, not yet. Declan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set his coffee on the bench beside him and removed his glasses. He cleaned them slowly with the edge of his shirt. Then he said something she did not expect. 8 years ago, I was researching the same thing. He told her the story in pieces, the way people do when recounting a failure they haven't fully forgiven themselves for. He had stumbled across irregularities in county land records, missing pages, inconsistent signatures, transfers that lacked mandatory authorizations. The patterns pointed to something systematic, something that had been carried out over decades. He had followed the trail for nearly a year. And then one evening, he found his car windshield shattered in the parking lot outside his office. 2 days later, a voicemail from a number that no longer existed. A man's voice, calm and precise, suggesting that his research had reached its natural conclusion. Declan stopped. He put his glasses back on and looked at the mountains rising above the town. I walked away. Packed up my notes, archived the files, told myself it wasn't worth the risk. I've been carrying that decision around my neck ever since. Nora studied his face. She saw the weight of it there. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet erosion that comes from knowing. You chose safety over truth. She opened her bag and pulled out a photograph she had found inside the iron box. It showed a group of people standing in front of a large property, faces solemn, postures stiff. She handed it to him without a word. Declan examined it, turned it over, read the faded notation on the back. Then he looked up at her. Where do we start? They started at the regional records office in Marion, a low brick building that smelled of old paper and industrial cleaning solution. Declan knew the cataloging system. Nora did the searching, pulling boxes from shelves, opening folders, running her fingers down columns of names and dates, while dust gathered on her sleeves. The work was slow and tedious. Most of what they found was ordinary routine filings, tax assessments, unremarkable transfers between parties whose names meant nothing. But occasionally something surfaced that made them both pause. A property deed with a page missing, not torn out recently, but cleanly removed long ago, the binding still flat where the sheet had been extracted. A transfer of 12 acres from a Hargrove to a name neither of them recognized, dated 1957, lacking the required notarization. A survey document with measurements that contradicted an earlier survey of the same parcel by nearly 40%. By the end of the first day, they had identified 7 anomalies. Each one taken alone might have been an administrative error. Taken together, they formed something that looked very much like a pattern. Declan spread the documents across the table in his small office back in Elkhorn Hollow. A rented room above the post office, its walls lined with maps and filing cabinets. He arranged them chronologically and began marking connections with a red pen. The same surnames kept appearing, the same parcels kept changing hands, and one family name surfaced more frequently than any other: Caldwell. The name meant nothing to Nora at first. Declan explained. The Caldwell family had been prominent in the region for generations. Landowners, business operators, employers. Vernon Caldwell, the current patriarch, still maintained significant influence across several counties. His name appeared on hospital boards, church committees, county commissions. A pillar of the community, as such men were often described. Declan pointed to a cluster of documents from the late 1950s. In each one, a property that had originally belonged to a branch of the Hargrove family appeared within months under the control of entities connected to the Caldwells. The transfers were technically legal, but the documentation was thin, suspiciously thin. Nora stared at the papers. Somewhere inside her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months began to solidify. Not anger exactly, something quieter, determination perhaps, or the particular stubbornness that comes from having already lost everything and discovering that the loss had a shape she hadn't recognized. That evening back at the cabin, she returned to the journal. She had been reading it in order following Connie's chronology from beginning to end. But now she skipped ahead, searching for specific references for the names that matched what she and Declan had found, and she found them. Connie had documented many of the same irregularities, sometimes in more detail, sometimes with information that didn't appear in any public record. The old woman had been conducting her own investigation for years, quietly, methodically alone. Nora read late into the night. The cabin settled around her, its wood ticking softly as the temperature dropped outside. She turned page after page, absorbing names and dates and fragments of a conspiracy that seemed to span generations. Then near the back of the journal, she found a loose envelope she hadn't noticed before. It was stuck between pages that had partially adhered to each other with age. She separated them carefully. The envelope was newer than most of the materials in the box, the paper less yellowed, the ink less faded. Inside was a single sheet covered in Connie's handwriting. The letter described a man who had contacted Connie several times over the years, asking questions about the cabin, about family documents, about certain records related to the Hargrove properties. Connie had found his interest unusual, even suspicious. She had kept track of his inquiries, and she had written down his name. Nora read it. Then she read it again. Then she set the letter down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood, as if the surface might keep her steady. The name was Grant Whitfield. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Not physically, the floor stayed level, the walls stayed plumb, but something inside her shifted, some internal architecture that she thought the divorce had already dismantled completely. She was wrong. There were rooms inside her that hadn't collapsed yet, and this new knowledge moved through them like a tremor. Grant had known about the cabin, about the family history, about the documents, not recently, not after the divorce, but years before. According to Connie's letter, his inquiry stretched back over a decade. He had been researching the Hargrove inheritance while they were still married, while they were still sharing a bed and a breakfast table, and the quiet routines of a life she believed was mutual. She sat with this knowledge for a long time. The candle on the table burned down to a stub. Outside, an owl called once, twice, then fell silent. In the morning, she called him. He answered on the fourth ring. His voice carried the same studied neutrality she remembered from the attorney's office. She didn't waste time. She told him she had found Connie's journal. She told him she had read the letter. She asked him directly why he had spent years investigating her family's inheritance without ever mentioning it. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for her to hear him breathing. When he finally spoke, his words came out rehearsed and flat. He said he had heard rumors about old family properties. He said it was casual curiosity, nothing more. He said she was overreacting. Nora listened, and in his voice she heard something she recognized: the careful management of someone who has been caught, but believes he can still control the narrative. She drove to Asheville that afternoon. She did not call ahead. She found him at the house, his house now, the one he had purchased shortly after the divorce, a renovated craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street. He opened the door, and his expression confirmed everything his voice had tried to deny. Surprise, calculation, a quick rearrangement of features into something that resembled calm. They stood in his living room. She did not sit down. She placed the letter on his coffee table and asked her questions. He deflected, minimized, offered explanations that dissolved under the slightest pressure. Then she asked the question that had been forming inside her for weeks, the one she hadn't known she needed to ask until this moment. Was any of it real, Grant? The marriage? 32 years. Was any of it real? He looked at her, and for the first time since the divorce, his composure cracked, not dramatically, not with tears or confession, but with a silence that said more than any words could. a silence that stretched across the room like a bridge with no far side. Nora picked up the letter. She walked to the door. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She stepped outside into the October air and felt something she hadn't expected. Clarity. Not happiness, not relief, but the particular sharpness that comes from finally seeing a thing exactly as it is, without the soft filter of hope distorting its edges. She drove back to the mountains as the sun dropped below the ridgeline. When she reached the cabin, the first thing she noticed was the tire. The rear left, completely flat. She knelt beside it and found the cut clean, straight, deliberate. Not a nail, not road damage, a blade. She stood slowly and looked toward the trees. The light was fading. Shadows pooled between the trunks like dark water. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed, except the table. On the table, placed precisely in the center, where she could not possibly miss it, was a folded piece of paper that had not been there when she left that morning. No envelope, no postmark, just a single sheet placed by a hand that had entered the cabin while she was gone. She unfolded it. Some doors are meant to stay closed. 5 words, no signature. Block letters written in black ink, steady and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who was not afraid. Nora placed the note beside Connie's journal. She looked at the 2 documents side by side, one written by a woman who had spent her life trying to open a door, and one written by someone determined to keep it shut. She called Declan. He arrived within the hour. When she showed him the note and the slashed tire, his face tightened, but he did not suggest stopping. Instead, he sat down at the table and opened the journal to a section they hadn't yet examined closely. He had been cross-referencing Connie's entries with the county records and had found something that warranted a deeper search, references to a second archive in a neighboring county that might contain original documents the regional office didn't have. Before they could discuss it further, his phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered. The voice on the other end spoke for less than 10 seconds. He was advised to discontinue any research related to the Hargrove family. Then the line went dead. When he tried to call back, the number was no longer in service. Declan set the phone on the table. He stared at it. Nora watched him. She saw the ghost of the man who had walked away 8 years ago flickering behind his eyes, the part of him that remembered how much easier it was to stop to archive the files, to choose silence. He looked up at her. "They want us to quit." She held his gaze. "I know." A long pause. The cabin creaked around them. "Are we going to..." Nora thought about the 14 boxes in her studio apartment. The photograph face down in a corner. The signature on the divorce papers. The empty expression on Grant's face. The 32 years she had spent building something on a foundation she now knew was hollow. No. The next morning, they drove to the neighboring county seat. The archive there was smaller, less organized, housed in a former courthouse basement, where water stains climbed the walls and the fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects. They spent hours pulling boxes from metal shelves, sifting through folders so old the paper crumbled at the edges. Late in the afternoon, Declan found it. A file misfiled in a box labeled Agricultural Surveys, 1940 to 1945. Inside was a set of property transfer documents from 1957 and 1958. Unlike the records they had seen before, these were complete. Every page present. Every signature visible. And the signatures told a story that was impossible to misread. 7 separate transfers, 7 properties, all originally belonging to branches of the Hargrove family. Each one signed over to different buyers. But the handwriting on the seller's signatures, supposedly 7 different people, was identical. The same hand had signed every document. The same person had pretended to be 7 different property owners authorizing the sale of land that was not theirs to sell. Nora held the documents under the fluorescent light and felt her pulse in her fingertips. This was not a suspicion. This was not a pattern that could be explained away as coincidence or error. This was evidence. Declan examined the buyer names. Two of them were entities he had already connected to the Caldwell family. A third matched a name that appeared in Connie's journal. The web was becoming visible, not all of it, not yet, but enough to see that it was real and that it was large. They photographed every page. They requested certified copies. They worked quickly and quietly, aware that the clock was running on something they could feel, but not yet see. As they carried the last of the copied documents to the car, Nora glanced across the street. A man stood near a parked sedan, pretending to read something on his phone. He wore a dark jacket and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. She had never seen him before. But something about his posture, the angle of his shoulders, the way his weight shifted when she looked in his direction, told her he was not there by accident. She said nothing to Declan until they were in the car with the doors locked. Then she described what she had seen. He checked the mirror. The man was gone. They drove back to Elkhorn Hollow in near silence. The document sat in a folder on the back seat. Evidence of a fraud that had been buried for more than 60 years, now riding in a 10-year-old sedan along mountain roads that twisted through forests already turning amber and red with autumn. 3 days later, Vernon Caldwell invited Nora to coffee. The message arrived through Loretta at the general store, a folded note left on the counter with Nora's name written in a hand that was confident and precise. Loretta handed it over without comment, but her eyes lingered on Nora's face a moment longer than usual. Nora read the note. One line. Mr. Caldwell would be pleased to meet you at the Ridgeline Cafe Thursday, 10 o'clock. She went. Not because she wanted to, but because she understood that refusing would communicate fear, and fear was the one thing she could no longer afford. Vernon Caldwell was already seated when she arrived. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired with the kind of tan that comes from outdoor leisure rather than outdoor labor. His clothes were expensive but not ostentatious. A well-cut sport coat and open collar. A watch that caught the light each time he lifted his coffee cup. He rose when she entered and extended his hand. His grip was firm. His smile was warm. His eyes were absolutely still. For the first few minutes, he talked about nothing. The weather, the beauty of the fall foliage, a brief history of the cafe they were sitting in, which had apparently been a blacksmith shop before the war. He spoke the way powerful men often do in small towns, with a casual authority that assumes agreement. Then, without any change in tone, he shifted. I understand you've been spending time in the county archives. Nora met his gaze and said nothing. Vernon smiled. He set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. I've always admired curiosity. It's a fine quality. But I've also learned that certain kinds of curiosity can lead people into places that are harder to leave than they were to enter. He paused, took another sip. Some truths. Nora, and I hope you don't mind me using your first name. Some truths can cause more damage than the lies they replace. Not because the truth isn't important, but because the people it touches didn't choose to be involved. His voice was gentle, reasonable, almost kind. And that was what made it so unsettling, the way he delivered what was unmistakably a threat, while maintaining the cadence and courtesy of a man offering friendly advice. Nora looked at him across the table. She thought about Connie alone in the cabin, for decades protecting documents she never dared to make public. She thought about Declan packing away his research because a shattered windshield told him to stop. She thought about Grant, who had understood the value of what was hidden, but lacked the honesty to pursue it openly. And she thought about herself, the woman who had sat in an attorney's office 2 months ago, unable to grip a pen, watching her life be filed away in a manila folder. That woman would have nodded politely, would have thanked Mr. Caldwell for the coffee, would have driven back to the cabin and started packing. But that woman no longer occupied this chair. Nora set her hands on the table. She kept her voice even. I appreciate you taking the time to meet me, Mr. Caldwell. The coffee is very good. She placed a $5 bill beside her cup, and walked out of the cafe without looking back. She was halfway across the square when she realized her hands were shaking, but she kept walking. That evening, she and Declan spread the full collection of documents across the cabin floor. Every photograph, every letter, every filing, every page of the journal. They knelt among the papers like archaeologists assembling fragments of a buried city. Declan connected names to dates. Nora matched properties to transfers. They worked until well past midnight, building a timeline that stretched across 6 decades and implicated at least 4 prominent families. The evidence was substantial, it was real, and it was enough to take to an attorney who specialized in property fraud and historical claims. But as Nora pinned the last document to the makeshift board they had assembled on the wall, she felt something else pressing against the edges of her focus, a question she couldn't quite name. The documents told her what had happened, but they didn't tell her why Connie had chosen this particular method of revelation. The hidden box, the coded entries, the breadcrumb trail designed to be followed by a single person. She reached into her shirt and touched the brass key hanging from its chain against her collarbone. It was warm from her skin. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, feeling its worn teeth, its familiar weight. The key had opened the cabin door. The iron box had opened the past. But something told her that the most important lock hadn't been found yet. She was about to say this to Declan when a sound cut through the silence. A sharp crack from outside, close, followed by the rapid crunch of footsteps moving through dry leaves. Declan was on his feet instantly. He crossed to the window and looked out into the darkness. A figure moved between the trees, not running but walking fast, purposeful, unhurried, heading away from the cabin toward the ridge. Declan grabbed a flashlight and went out the door. Nora followed. They reached the tree line in seconds. The flashlight beam swept across trunks and underbrush. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. Whoever had been there had vanished into the dark like smoke dissolving into air. But on the ground beside the cabin's east wall, directly beneath the window of the room where they had been working, they found a fresh bootprint pressed deep into the mud. And beside it, partially hidden under a fallen leaf, was a cigarette butt still warm to the touch. Someone had been standing there, watching, for a long time. Nora looked at Declan. In the faint light spilling from the cabin windows, she could see the tension in his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. But she could also see something else, something that hadn't been there when they first met on that sidewalk outside the old archive. He wasn't going to walk away this time. Neither was she. They went back inside and locked the door. Through the window, the mountains stood black against a sky filled with more stars than Nora had ever seen, cold, ancient, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. Somewhere out there, someone was making a phone call, and on the other end, a voice was asking how much longer they intended to wait before intervening directly. The answer, when it came, was brief, and it meant that everything Nora and Declan had built over the past weeks, every document, every connection, every fragile thread of truth, was about to be tested in ways neither of them had yet imagined. The days that followed the break-in moved with a different kind of urgency. Nora and Declan no longer worked only during daylight. They digitized every document, photographed every page of the journal, and stored copies in 3 separate locations. Declan's office, a safety deposit box in Marion, and an encrypted file sent to the attorney they had contacted in Asheville. If someone destroyed the originals, the evidence would survive. The attorney, a woman named Patricia Hollowell, who specialized in historical property claims, reviewed the initial materials and called back within 48 hours. Her voice carried the particular restraint of someone who has learned not to promise anything prematurely. But beneath that caution, Nora detected something else. Interest. Genuine, sustained interest. Patricia explained that the forged signatures alone, if authenticated by independent experts, would constitute grounds for a formal investigation. Several of the transfers lacked documentation that had been legally required, even in the 1950s. The pattern was too consistent to attribute to clerical negligence. Someone had designed this. Someone had maintained it across decades. Nora hung up the phone and sat at the table where the journal lay open to a page she had read so many times. The words had worn grooves into her memory. She traced Connie's handwriting with her fingertip. The old woman had known all of this, had gathered the same evidence, had reached the same conclusions. And yet, she never went public, never contacted an attorney, never filed a claim. Why? The answer arrived 3 days later, in a place Nora had been circling around without realizing it. She and Declan drove to the abandoned railway station that Connie's journal described, the building marked in red ink on the back of a photograph, the place Connie had written about using words that now felt less like directions and more like a final wish. The station sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't been maintained in years. Saplings had pushed through the old platform. The ticket window was a dark rectangle framed by rotting wood. Part of the roof had surrendered to gravity and weather, leaving a section of the interior open to the sky. They searched for over an hour. Declan moved through the main hall while Nora examined the smaller rooms at the back, a former office, a storage closet, a space that might once have been used for sorting mail. The walls were damp, the floor was uncertain, everything smelled of mildew and rust, and the particular sweetness of wood returning slowly to earth. She almost missed it. A section of baseboard in the old office sat slightly higher than the rest, lifted by a fraction of an inch, that would have been invisible to anyone not actively searching. She knelt and pressed the edge. It shifted. Behind it, set into a cavity between the floor joists, was a metal box smaller than the one she had found in the attic, but similar in construction, iron rectangular, latched but not locked. Inside were documents wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Property deeds, original notarized contracts bearing dates from the 1940s and 1950s. Correspondence between attorneys and county officials. And among them, the clearest evidence yet, a series of transfer authorizations on which the signatures of deceased Hargrove family members appeared beside dates that fell months or even years after their recorded deaths. The dead had signed away their land. That was the shape of the fraud, stripped of all its complexity. Someone had taken the names of people who could no longer object and written those names on documents that transferred everything they had owned to people who had no rightful claim. Declan held one of the deeds up to the light filtering through the broken roof. His hands were steady, but Nora could see the muscle working in his jaw. 8 years of guilt were pressing against the surface. This is enough. This is more than enough. Nora nodded, but she was looking at something else, an envelope resting at the bottom of the box, separate from the legal documents placed there with obvious intention. It was not old. The paper was cream-colored and only faintly yellowed, and on its face, written in Connie's unmistakable hand, was a name, Nora Whitfield. Not to whom it may concern, not to the finder. Her name, written with the certainty of someone who knew exactly whose hands would eventually hold it. Nora picked up the envelope. It weighed almost nothing. She opened it standing in the ruins of that station while dust motes turned slowly in the afternoon light, and the mountains stood silent and enormous beyond the broken windows. The letter inside covered 3 pages. Connie's handwriting was smaller here than in the journal, more deliberate, as if each word had been chosen with the care of someone placing stones in a wall that needed to hold. The first page explained what Nora had already begun to understand, that Connie had spent the better part of her adult life gathering evidence of the fraud. She described the scope of it without emotion, the way a cartographer might describe a coastline. Families, properties, decades, a network of quiet theft maintained through intimidation, complicity, and the convenient passage of time. The second page explained why she never acted. And here Nora felt the letter shift beneath her, felt it become something different from what she had expected. Connie wrote that she had considered going public many times. She had drafted letters to attorneys, to journalists, to county prosecutors. She had come close on 3 separate occasions. Each time she stopped. Not because of threats, though there had been threats. Not because of fear, though she had been afraid. She stopped because she understood something about the nature of the evidence she held. It could restore property. It could correct records. It could punish the guilty. But it could not by itself repair the deeper damage, the decades of silence, the family members who had accepted their diminished circumstances without knowing why, the generations that grew up believing they had simply been unlucky. Justice delivered by a stranger. Connie wrote changes the record. Justice discovered through one's own hands changes the person. Nora read that sentence twice. The station creaked around her. Wind moved through the gaps in the walls. The third page was shorter, and it was addressed not to a researcher or an heir or a legal claimant. It was addressed to the woman Connie had watched grow up from a distance, through letters from relatives, through photographs passed along at holidays, through the quiet observation of someone who paid attention to the people others overlooked. Connie wrote that she had always seen something in Nora that Nora herself seemed unable to recognize. A steadiness, a refusal to abandon things even when those things, a difficult marriage, a thankless devotion, a life built around someone else's needs, might have been worth abandoning sooner. It was a strength that looked from the outside like patience. But Connie believed it was something rarer. It was the willingness to stay in a room that everyone else had left, not out of weakness, but because something in that room still mattered. The fortune can be recovered, Connie wrote. Attorneys can manage that. Courts can order it. But a woman who has lost herself, that is the harder rescue. And no court on earth can order it done. That journey can only be walked. I designed this path for you, Nora. Every clue, every locked door, every night alone in that cabin, wondering what you were doing there. I needed you to find your own way through. Because the inheritance that matters most is not the land or the money. It is the woman you become while searching for it. Nora lowered the letter. The pages trembled slightly in her hands. She became aware of tears on her face, not the violent chest-heaving sobs of the car outside the attorney's office months ago, but something quieter. Warmer, like rain falling on ground that had been dry for a very long time. Declan stood a few feet away. He had not read the letter. He didn't need to. Whatever it contained was written on her face clearly enough. After a while, she folded the pages and placed them back in the envelope. She held it against her chest for a moment, the way she had held the journal on that first stormy night in the attic. Then she put it in her coat pocket next to the brass key. They drove back to the cabin in near silence. But it was a different silence than before. Not the tense quiet of people guarding themselves, but the restful silence of people who no longer need words to confirm that they are on the same side. That evening, sitting on the porch while the last light of October painted the ridgeline in copper and plum, Declan told her something he had never said aloud. 8 years ago, when I stopped the research, I told myself it was a rational decision, that I was protecting my career, my safety, my future. But the truth is simpler than that. I was a coward. I let someone else's threat become my permission to quit. He paused, looked at his hands. Watching you refuse to stop, even when every reasonable voice in the room was telling you to, it changed something. You gave me back a part of myself I thought was gone. Nora looked at him. The man who had appeared on a sidewalk with a leather satchel and a paper cup of coffee, offering his knowledge with the quiet hope that it might this time lead somewhere he didn't have to be ashamed of. She reached over and took his hand. Neither of them said anything more. They sat together on the porch of a cabin that had been silent for years and was now finally full of something other than secrets. The weeks that followed moved quickly. Patricia Hollowell assembled a team. Independent handwriting analysts confirmed what Nora and Declan had suspected. The signatures on multiple transfer documents were fraudulent, written by the same hand. Property records were subpoenaed. County officials were interviewed. The scope of the investigation widened from a single family's claim into a regional inquiry that drew attention from state-level authorities. People began to talk. Not just the careful sideways conversations that had followed Nora through Elkhorn Hollow since her arrival, but direct, purposeful testimony. An elderly woman named Ruth Jessup drove 40 minutes from her home to meet Nora at the diner. She brought a shoebox filled with letters her father had kept, letters that described in plain language meetings, where land transfers were discussed and payments were made to ensure cooperation. She set the box on the table and pushed it across with both hands. My daddy carried this his whole life. He was too scared to show anyone. I'm too old to be scared anymore. Others followed. A retired surveyor who remembered being told to alter boundary measurements. A former clerk who recalled filing documents she knew were incomplete. A minister's widow who had overheard conversations at her husband's study that she never forgot and never repeated until now. Each testimony was a small stone placed on a scale. None of them alone would have tipped the balance. Together they created a weight that could no longer be ignored. Vernon Caldwell retained a team of attorneys who challenged the authenticity of the documents and questioned Nora's motives. Newspaper editorials appeared suggesting she was a bitter divorcee pursuing fantasies. Legal motions were filed to delay proceedings. Every tool available to wealth and influence was deployed with practiced efficiency. But the evidence held. It held because Connie had spent decades making sure it would storing originals in locations where moisture and time could not reach them. Recording details in a journal that served as both map and testimony. Building a case that was designed not for speed but for permanence. The first formal ruling came on a Tuesday in late January. Nora was sitting in Patricia's office when the call arrived. Several properties were officially recognized as having been fraudulently transferred from the Hargrove family. Restitution proceedings would begin immediately. Additional claims were under review. Patricia set down the phone and looked at Nora. "This is real. This is happening." Nora nodded. She did not celebrate. She did not cry. She sat in the chair and felt something settle inside her. Not triumph, not vindication, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of a thing finally being placed where it belonged. Grant called her 2 days later. She let it ring 4 times before answering. His voice was different now, smaller, uncertain, stripped of the composure that had once made her feel like the unreasonable one. He said he wanted to explain. He said things had gotten complicated. He said he never meant for any of it to go the way it did. Nora listened. She let him finish. Then she said the only thing that was left to say. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Grant." She hung up. The same words he had spoken to her on the sidewalk outside the attorney's office. But where his had been empty, a pleasantry tossed like a coin into a fountain. Hers carried something different. She meant them. She genuinely hoped he would find whatever it was he had been chasing through all those years of quiet deception, because she understood now that whatever he found, it would never be enough. Not because the world is unkind, but because a life built on hidden motives eventually becomes a house with no rooms you can actually live in. Spring came early that year. By March, the dogwoods along the mountain roads had erupted into white and pink, and the rhododendron were beginning to show the first tight buds that would open into purple clusters by May. Nora hired a team of carpenters and restoration specialists. The cabin's roof was rebuilt using timber milled from trees on the property itself. The porch was reinforced. The windows were replaced with glass that let in the light, but kept out the drafts that had made her first nights there so cold. The stone fireplace was repointed and cleaned, and the first fire she lit in it burned steadily for 6 hours without a single adjustment. She did not turn the cabin into a private home. That had never been the plan, not since the night she read Connie's letter in the ruins of the railway station. Instead, she created a place. A small heritage center, open to anyone who wanted to visit. The main room held a permanent exhibition: photographs, documents, maps, and personal artifacts that told the story of the families who had lived in these mountains for generations. Connie's journal occupied a glass case near the center, open to the page that read, "If you are reading this, it means that time has finally come." Loretta donated a collection of postcards from the 1930s. Silas Pemberton, who had watched Nora from his bench on the square all those months ago without speaking, finally walked through the door one afternoon carrying a wooden box filled with hand-carved tools his grandfather had made. He set them on the counter, looked around the room, and spoke for the first time directly to her. Connie would have liked this. She always said this place deserved to remember what it was. He left before Nora could respond, but he came back the following week, and the week after that. Eventually, she found him sitting on the porch most mornings when she arrived, drinking coffee from a thermos and watching the mist dissolve between the ridges. Months passed. The legal proceedings continued slowly, as such things do, but steadily. More properties were returned. Compensation was awarded. The name Hargrove, which had been spoken in whispers for decades, began to be spoken normally again openly, without the flinch that had accompanied it for so long. Nora and Declan settled into a life that neither of them had anticipated. It was unhurried, built on mornings spent reading on the porch and afternoons working side by side in the Heritage Center, and evenings cooking simple meals in the cabin's restored kitchen, while the mountains turned blue and then black outside the windows. They did not rush toward anything. They had both spent too many years moving at speeds set by other people's expectations. This pace, slow, deliberate, chosen, felt like the first honest rhythm either of them had known. One evening in late autumn, nearly a year after she had first driven up that narrow dirt road, with nothing but a tarnished key and a hollow feeling behind her ribs, Nora sat alone on the porch. Declan had gone to Marion for a meeting. The Heritage Center was closed for the day. The valley below was filled with the amber light that comes only in the last hour before sunset, when the sun drops low enough to illuminate the underside of every leaf, and the air itself seems to glow. She reached into the collar of her shirt and lifted the brass key from where it rested against her skin. She had worn it every day since the notary mailed it to her in that small padded envelope. It had opened the cabin door on the first afternoon. It had hung around her neck while she read the journal in the attic during the storm. It had pressed against her chest during the meeting with Vernon Caldwell. It had been in her pocket when she found the letter at the railway station. She held it now in the fading light and turned it slowly between her fingers. The teeth were so worn they could barely catch on anything. The brass had darkened to the color of old honey. It was by any practical measure useless. It no longer opened any lock. But that was not entirely true. She looked out at the mountains. The ridgeline was sharp against a sky that had turned the color of ripe peaches. A single bird, she didn't know what kind, traced a wide, unhurried circle above the valley and then disappeared beyond the trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and dry leaves, and the faint mineral scent of the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Somewhere inside the cabin, the old clock on the wall, repaired now, keeping time again after years of silence, ticked softly in steady rhythm. Nora hung the key on a small iron hook beside the front door. It caught the last sliver of sunlight and held it for a moment, glowing faintly against the dark wood like an ember that refused to go out. She had arrived at this cabin believing her life was over, that everything she had built had been taken, that she had nothing left. And in a way that had been true. The life she knew was over. The things she had built were gone. But what she hadn't understood then, what she could not have understood until she had walked every step of the path Connie had laid out for her, was that some doors only open after you've lost every key you thought you needed. The mountains darkened. The first stars appeared. Nora pulled a blanket over her shoulders and stayed on the porch for a long time, listening to the sounds of a world that had been there all along, waiting for her to arrive. If this story stayed with you tonight, I'd love to hear your answer to one question. What is something you once believed was your greatest loss that turned out to be the beginning of something you never expected? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't yet, subscribe so we can meet here again next week with another story. Good night.